Hi, everyone. Welcome again to our book talks. I'm Dora Guzman. I am a contributor to our Latinos and Kidlit blog. I'm here with,
Hi everyone, I'm Sonia Alejandra Rodriguez. I'm also a contributor to the Latinx and Kidlit blog.
and today we're talking about the Storyteller's Candle, La Velita de los Cuentos by Lucia Gonzalez, illustrated by Lulu Delacre. And so this was a 2009 Pura Belpre Award nominee for narrative and illustration. It was also a 2009 Jane Addams Children's Book Award. So what did you think, Sonia?
We're obviously here talking about like the celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Pura Belpre Award, which is also very timely that we're talking about Pura Belpre's story. And I like the way that Gonzalez and Delacre took what could have just been a very typical like biographical like nonfiction book, but instead framed it around the eyes of a child. What is it? Hilda Maria is the name of the young girl through this.
Yeah, Hilda Maria in Santiago.
Hilda Maria, and Hilda Maria wants to go to the library, right? And her and her family think it's not a place for them because they don't speak Spanish at the library and they don't speak English. And in the Storyteller's Candle, Gonzalez and Delacre introduce Belpre, right? As this like, no, like we're gonna change the notions of what we understand the library to be. And I thought it was a very creative way to take like a biographical story and frame it through the eyes of a child. I really enjoyed that about this book.
Yeah, this is my second or third time reading this picture book, and it took me a while, right, to figure out, I'm like, wait, is the child Pura Belpre, right? Is it her story, right, through the lens of, like you said, another child? But I really appreciated how she was this primary character, right? But again, like learning through the lens of like the family versus the lens of, Pura Belpre and her surrounding family. It's very similar to, I mean, if we all know Pura Belpre and, we've read Planting Stories, like stories about her and her influence on the community. But I think it really resonates here, right? Seeing the story from the community, right? Like what was their same place, same time, but a different perspective on how influential she was. That part though with the library and how that moment that you talked about where they walked by and they're like, oh no, the library isn't for us because we don't speak English, like that touched my heart in so many ways. I was like, oh my goodness, this was like a legit feeling. Yes.
I think it's that part, so, and I kept mispronouncing or misnaming this character's name. Her name is Ilamar.
It's okay.
Yeah, and you like even just in the way that Delacre like illustrates this moment, like I mean, Ildamar is like still pointing, wanting to stay back. Like you could see like the resistance in this picture to like, but I want to go in there, right? I want to go there, yeah. Right? And the mom, pulling her. It's a very like I feel like iconic like mother-child picture. Like we gotta go, and the kid's like, no, I want to go there. Like this resistance that Ildamar doesn't even know that like that she's doing, right? Like I want to go in there. You say I don't belong in there, but I want to. Why can't we go? Why can't we go there? Which I think is also just like a frame, or just like a theme that is important throughout this book, right? That like what Belpre was doing for the libraries for these communities at that time, right, was a form of resistance that she wasn't necessarily staging as like this is taking a political stance. This is going to be the revolution, as much as it was like I want to bring these stories to my community, right? Even though it was both, right? So. Yeah. I found it very subtle.
And it wasn't really like a point of like, let me ask for permission, right? Or let me prove that this is needed, right? It was, I like that word resistance, because it was almost as if she, and well, we know she just, she thought it was important and she did it, right? She didn't really ask, at least from my perspective, I don't feel like she had asked for permission or go or jump through hoops, right, to tell these stories. Which, yeah, it reminded me of even like growing up, And I like love libraries, right? Like the library is like my second home. And I think even more so now as an adult than as a kid. But even as a kid, I remember just not feeling like, I was meant to be there. And so that part really stood out to me because our libraries didn't look like, the library that Lulu Delacre illustrated on the page, right? They were smaller. I grew up in suburban Illinois, so it was a small town, a lot smaller library. It was like one floor. But even then, I felt like none of the books that were displayed really resonated, right? It was hard to find things. And it was just a space where like I felt like, I mean, if I go back now, hopefully it's changed, but I really connected with that because I'm like, if that space didn't really connect with me, how many other spaces or how many other children like myself, right, kind of avoided going to the library because they weren't, connecting with it or felt like they belonged there.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, definitely. And I agree with you that like it just, I mean, the library for me growing up was just also essential, but I also always thought that the library was like an essential part of like an immigrant's community or like an immigrant um like experience like into entering like American society, right? Like I just always thought that that's like what immigrants did. Like you
yeah,
arrive to this country, you got to find the library, and that's
yeah,
like how you like familiarize yourself with like American society, or even just find resources because that's what my family did. And I totally feel you, and like the New York Public Library is massive compared to like the little library I well Cicero, Illinois, right? Like it was when I was a child, it was one story building, and over time, right, they built it into two stories now. But I remember I remember like the children's section and just how like enamored I was with seeing these books and that I could take these
yeah,
books. It was just like such a wonderful experience. And here we have Ildamar like I feel like tapping into all of that, right? That there is this connection between like immigrant communities and libraries, right? Even if sometimes libraries don't want that to be true, right? Or if they're not offering services to make that a reality, but there's something integral about like immigrant communities and libraries.
yeah. And you see that come together when they have to come together to make this play, right? And it's
Yeah.
not solely on Pura, right? It's not solely on her. She asks for, the community, especially the community of immigrants, right, to say, hey, these are our traditions, right? These are our stories. I need your help to create, right, this play to showcase to everyone else, right? So that everybody else can learn from us. That was
Yeah.
also so powerful too, because she is a symbol of like you need to continue telling your story, right, and going into these spaces. But I feel like it was like I'm not doing it alone, right? So that was another way that I saw like, okay, library is a community, but you could also build community within it, right? Because everybody's going for their own thing, but you could also get to know one another, talk to one another, right, and build from there.
Yeah, I like that moment where Pura Belpre visits Ildamar's classroom, and that's how Ildamar learns, right, that there are Spanish-speaking people at the library. We can go there, right? And I think we've talked about this before when we talk about, I forget what other books we talked about, but in terms of like that, like when these characters, when child protagonists often learn like new information, right, new knowledge, it's often the child's responsibility to then share it with the family and the community, right? Because that's how like information starts trickling down. And so, like you said, right, it becomes a community endeavor versus like, well, I'm going to keep this information to myself, right? That like if you've learned something, it's your responsibility to pass it on, right, to those who may not be in that classroom. And we see that, like you mentioned, with Belpre saying, I'm sharing these stories, but now we need all of your help to create something much more like magical. We're going to put on a play, right? And so it really is about like a community, um, like endeavor, communal like resistance, right? It's not like an individual perspective.
Well, and that connects back to the Latinx experience, right? Well, this is why this book won, was nominated for narration and illustration because if you think about like, you know, my experience is, you know, you get stories through like your family, right? Or pieces of information that's through your family and your community. You don't just learn something and then just like, okay, we're just gonna keep this in this corner
Yeah.
and just like not talk about it. But the illustrations was something that I also wanted to talk to you about. It just, you know, I think we both talked about how before this video, how Lulu Delacre used the newspaper articles within her art. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and you can see it on the cover too, right? So
Oh, didn't.
throughout all the illustrations, throughout the layouts, right, there are moments. So I'll point to the introduction, right? There are moments where, like, right, so you'll have the text in Spanish and English, but then within the illustrations, there might be some pages that have like newspaper collages in there, right? And it's all over, the book. And the artist,
And we tried really hard, even though I mean I identify as a nerd. I'm pretty sure trying to read, I'm like, what está
is that?
pasando aquí?
Yeah.
Like, what's happening?
Yeah, and it wasn't until I got to the very end, right? This is why like author content at the end or like an author's note is super important, right? Because there's an artist note that says, right, that the Delacre purposefully used newspaper clippings from that time period and included it as a collage and an element into the story. And so that whatever newspaper clipping she used matches whatever is the content or theme of that page. Right, so the example given in the artist statement is that on that page that I just showed, at the introduction that explains Puerto Ricans coming into Manhattan, right, that the newspaper collage part is from the New York Times at that time explaining Puerto Ricans coming into Manhattan, right? And I think that's a very, again, thinking about how we share knowledge, how we like archive our stories, right, that we see that doubly playing in Delacre's art. Right, she is reinterpreting this history or this biography, this story, but also layering in like this is archival, right? We didn't just make up Belpre as a mythical figure, right? We didn't just make up this like immigration story, right? But there are archival resources that say we've been here, right? And so I like that
But
element.
you know, I think about archives as, you know, there are stories as well, right, that are meant to be remembered. And I find it fascinating that without reading the author's note, I was like, this has to mean something, or maybe it doesn't, right? I just thought like maybe it's just like text and words and, you know, meshing with her story. But once, you know, you read that author's note, I was like, that makes a lot of sense, right? You're trying to, again, make sure that the story doesn't go untold, right, in the future years and for future generations. And I think, again, with the Pura Belpre Award, right, that story is going to continue on for generations to come, right, highlighting not only her story, right, but also the stories of just the Latinx communities and how important they are to keep.
Yeah, and I like that element, that visual element that I think that readers will enjoy. Because just like you, I was trying to, I was drawn to those newspaper clippings or to those words, and I was like, what is that? And I think there were some moments that they were like on a bookshelf. I was like, are these book titles? So of course, right, yeah, and total like nerd status. I was like, what is this? But then again, like also just thinking about the invisible labor, right, that us as readers don't see of what goes into the art, to the production of a story, into the production of like the art, right? How much research needed to go into this, and how much thought needed to go into like, well, what part of the clippings do I show, right? What part of, how do I angle them? What story do I want to highlight, right? I think all of that can turn into a conversation, right, with readers, with children and youth about how a story like this comes together. Right, and I really like that I like that potential that is being presented to us with this book.
Yeah, it adds a layer of like picture books are complex, right? You know, we both work with, you know, college level populations, and sometimes even during like my children's literature course, it's like, oh, it's a picture book, right? It's not for my, you know, readers who are in middle school or high school. I'm like, oh, yes, it is. You know, there's layers and there's questions that we can create so that we are looking at the process of the illustrations, right? And what that means, because it's intentional. So I'm glad that picture books are more, I guess, not exposed, but like used more, right? In a lot of discussions. We use them a lot in elementary, but I'm glad they're being used more as like, yes, these are complex as well. And they have a lot of meaning to it. Because if we didn't know that about the newspaper, then it would just been, oh, this is the artist, you know, just doing art. And it's like, no, that's not necessarily how it works, right? Everything has an intention and purpose.
Yeah. Which is why it's always important to read like everything in the book, right? Don't just skip like the end parts because it's not part of the story. Right? You got to read everything. Because I mean, you learn so much, right? Just from even just listening or reading like what the author illustrator have to say about their work. Or even just like the more like biographical like paragraph that they included about Pura Belpre, right? That gives you more information. I like stories about Pura Belpre in general, because now when I think about Pura Belpre, I think about and I don't know if you've read this book. It's called Side by Side by Dr. Marilisa Jimenez, and she talks a lot about Pura Belpre, right, as the foundation for not only like Latinx youth literature, but just as for what we understand to be like American youth literature and culture. And I appreciate in her book, like she just directly says, right, that like the foundations of American youth literature, the foundations of like Latinx youth literature in particular, are grounded in like Afro Latinx culture and like Afro Latinx experiences and Afro Latinx like epistemologies, like ways of knowing, ways of learning, and ways of communicating. That feels so true just when we read specifically stories that are about Pura Belpre, right? That there's no separating her Blackness from her Latinidad, her contribution to like what we now understand like Latinx youth literature, right, is grounded in her Blackness, right? And I also think about Arturo Schomburg, and so I feel like we keep talking about Belpre forever, but like that's kind of like what is so like amazing about, particularly like what I think about biographical books on Belpre, right? That there's so much to like discuss.
I read
about
another picture book that just was published too, Jump at the Sun, and it's by it's about Zora Neale Hurston. Yeah. So that's another one. I was like, oh my goodness, like these are, again, like you said, these are storytellers, right? And they don't separate themselves, and I just feel like it brings back a lot of just memories, right? For me especially, it brings back memories of like, you know, how my family was and how you hear stories about, you know, from your grandparents, from your parents, and how valuable those stories are. And often they're not, you know, in other spaces. But now again, with this award and with more conversations, you know, we're learning from them, right? So that they're not just disappearing.
Yeah, definitely. Right. And it also just highlights how like oral storytelling like is elemental, right, to like the preservation, creation, like future of these communities, right? And like oral storytelling grounded in like Black and Indigenous like traditions. Right? And it's just so important. But thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about the Storyteller's Candle. We didn't even get to talk about what the Storyteller's Candle actually is. Like it's a literal candle. It's a literal candle, right, that she would light when she was going to
start. I had my candle ready. I think I said I had my candle ready. I was like, oh no.
It's too hot for that candle right now. But it's a literal candle, right? That it's like this tradition that she would light up to start story time, and then she would ask a child to blow it out at the end and make a wish. I was like, that's so awesome. And again, right, just the potential and the magic and the imagination that she creates, right, or created for children and for their community. So that's awesome. But again, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about this book. Everyone, check out the book. Check out Latinx and Kidlit blog.
Yep, it's in English and Spanish.
Yeah. See you next time. Bye.